The bluebird was carved from mountain laurel, worn smooth by 60 years of touch. David had seen it all his life, sitting on his grandfather's mantel between the tarnished cavalry medal and the daguerreotype of a woman he'd never known. Tonight, for the first time, the old man picked it up. This bird, Samuel Winters, said, his voice like gravel rolling in a creek bed, cost me everything I thought I wanted, and gave me everything I needed. The December wind rattled the windows of the Missouri farmhouse. Outside, snow fell in thick curtains, the kind of snow that erased roads and buried mistakes. Inside, the fire crackled, throwing shadows that danced like memories across the walls. Samuel settled into his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. At 82, he still carried himself like a soldier, back straight, despite the years, shoulders broad, despite the burden. David, 16 and restless with the certainty of youth, leaned forward. "Grandpa, you've had that bird as long as I've been alive. What's so special about it?" Samuel turned the carving over in his hands. The firelight caught the grain of the wood, revealing layers of careful work, thousands of knife strokes that had transformed raw timber into something that almost seemed ready to fly. He'd held this bird on the coldest nights and the loneliest mornings. He'd held it when Margaret's face began to fade from memory and when the war nightmares came calling. He'd held it when he thought he might not make it through another winter. Special. Samuel looked at his grandson, seeing in the boy's eyes the same stubborn hope he'd once carried. "I suppose it is, but not for the reason you might think." He set the bird on the small table between them, next to the Bible his mother had given him before he marched off to war. The good book was worn, its spine cracked from use and weather. The bird was worn too, but from something else, from need, from remembering. "Winter of 1878, Samuel began. "I was 40 years old and I'd already been dead 3 years. David frowned. "Dead? Living," Samuel corrected, "but not alive. There's a difference, boy. You'll understand someday, though. I pray you never have to learn it the way I did." The old man's eyes grew distant, looking past the fire, past the walls, past the years that separated then from now. His hand moved unconsciously to his neck, tracing the scar that ran from just below his ear down to his collarbone. Shrapnel from Cold Harbor. June 3rd, 1864. The day he should have died, but didn't. It was December 15th, 1878. 6:15 in the morning. I know because I checked my pocket watch, a habit from the war. Always know what time it is when the day starts. Might be the last time you check. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Samuel didn't flinch. He'd been around too many fires, heard too many sudden sounds. Some men jumped at every noise. Samuel had learned to go still instead, to become part of the silence. The thermometer outside my cabin read 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow was 14 inches deep and still falling. I had 15 rounds left for my Winchester Model 1873. The cabin was 16 feet by 20 log walls, 8 inches thick, chinked with clay and moss I'd gathered myself. These details matter, David. A man my age lived or died by knowing the exact state of things. He paused, letting the specifics settle. Men of his generation, the ones who'd survived the war and the wilderness, they understood that precision wasn't about being particular. It was about staying alive. I'd been living in that cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia for 9 years total. 3 years since Margaret died. 3 years since our son Thomas died, with her never drawing a single breath in this world. David had heard the story before, or parts of it. His great-grandmother Margaret dead in childbirth. His great-uncle Thomas stillborn. But Grandpa Samuel had never spoken of it this way, with these hard edges and sharp corners. "Margaret asked me not to go hunting that day." Samuel's voice dropped lower, each word falling like a stone into still water. "She was 9 months along, could barely move. But we needed meat for the winter. I told her I'd be back before dark. Told her I'd bring venison enough to last us through to spring." The old man's jaw tightened. Even now, 42 years later, the muscle jumped beneath the weathered skin. "I got the deer. A buck 8 points, maybe 170 pounds. Took me 4 hours to field dress it and drag it back. When I came through the door at 5:30 that evening, I knew something was wrong. The midwife hadn't arrived. Margaret was on the floor trying to breathe through the pain. She looked at me, and I saw it in her eyes. Fear. Real fear. Margaret had never been afraid of anything in her life. Samuel closed his eyes. The scene played out behind his eyelids with perfect clarity. It always did. Some memories didn't fade. They just learned to wait. I tried to help her. I'd seen men die on battlefields, seen their insides on the outside, seen things no man should see. But birth, I didn't know anything about birth. I did what I could. It wasn't enough. She bled and I couldn't stop it. The baby Thomas, he was blue when he came. Never cried, never moved. Margaret held him for maybe 3 minutes before she closed her eyes. A log shifted in the fire. Neither of them moved. Her last words to me were, "Promise me something, Samuel. Promise me, if you ever find someone who needs you, someone you can actually save, don't fail them like you failed me." David started to protest, but Samuel raised a hand. "I know what you're going to say. It wasn't my fault. Nothing I could have done. People told me that for years. Didn't matter. I failed her. Failed our son. Failed at the one moment when being a man was supposed to mean something. So I made her the promise. And then I watched her die." The wind picked up outside, howling around the eaves. Samuel stood slowly, his joints protesting, and walked to the window. Snow covered everything, now smooth and white and clean. Nothing stayed buried forever, but snow tried its best. After that I lived. Got up every morning, checked my traps, cut firewood, hunted. But I wasn't alive. I was just a body going through motions, waiting for enough time to pass that dying wouldn't feel like giving up. He turned back to David, and the boy saw something in his grandfather's face he'd never seen before. Not sadness exactly, something older than sadness, something that had made peace with itself but would never forget. That's what I mean when I say I'd been dead 3 years. My heart beat. My lungs pulled air. But the part of me that mattered, the part that made me Samuel Winters instead of just meat and bone, that part was in the ground with Margaret and Thomas. Samuel sat back down the chair, creaking again. He picked up the carved bird, his thumb running along the smooth curve of its wing. 3 years I lived like that. December 15th, 1878 was day 1095 of being dead. I remember because I'd been counting. Stupid thing to do, counting dead days. But it gave me something to mark, something to measure. Even emptiness has dimensions if you pay attention. He set the bird down again, his hand lingering on it for just a moment. That morning started like all the others. I woke at 5:30, made coffee the real kind, not the chicory substitute we drank during the war, ate cornbread left over from the night before, put on my coat, the heavy wool one with the bullet hole in the left shoulder from Gettysburg, loaded my Winchester, went out to check my traps. Samuel's eyes grew sharper now, focusing on something David couldn't see. I had 12 traps set in a 2-mile radius around the cabin, mostly for rabbit and squirrel, sometimes fox. I checked them in the same order every time. North first, then east, then south, then west. Patterns keep a man sane when he's got nothing else. The old man leaned back, his gaze fixed on the fire, but seeing something else entirely, something 42 years past, but close as yesterday. I was on trap number 7, about 1.5 miles northeast of the cabin, when I heard the shots. David leaned forward. This was new. This was the part Grandpa had never told. 3 shots, rifle, not shotgun. I could tell by the crack, sharp and clean. They came from the east, maybe 3 miles away by my estimation. First shot, then maybe 5 seconds, then 2 more close together. Samuel's hand moved without thinking, fingers tapping against his leg. 1. Pause. 2. 3. Now lots of men hunted those mountains. Hearing shots wasn't unusual. But something about these was wrong. The spacing, the direction. A man hunting deer, he takes 1 shot, maybe 2 if he misses. 3 shots like that meant something else, meant someone wasn't hunting animals. The fire crackled. Snow tapped against the windows like impatient fingers. I stood there in the snow and I thought about Margaret, thought about her last words, thought about the promise I'd made, and I thought about how easy it would be to just check the rest of my traps and go home. Wasn't my business, wasn't my problem. I'd learned in the war that a man who goes looking for trouble usually finds more than he bargained for. Samuel's jaw set in that stubborn way David recognized, the look that said he'd made a decision and hell itself wouldn't change his mind. But I went anyway. Don't ask me why. Maybe it was the promise. Maybe it was just that I'd been dead so long I'd forgotten how to be afraid. Either way, I headed east, tracking toward those shots. The old man stood again this time, moving to the mantel. He picked up the daguerreotype of Margaret, studied it for a moment, then set it back with careful precision. The snow was coming down harder now. Good tracking snow, the kind that takes prints and holds them. I found the first set of tracks about half a mile in. Boot prints, size 11, I'd guess heavy tread. A man's boots moving fast. Then 20 yards further I found the second set. Samuel's voice went quiet, and David had to strain to hear over the fire. Small prints. A woman's shoes or maybe a girl's. Light impressions like whoever made them didn't weigh much or was running on their toes, and between the prints every 10 feet or so, drops of blood. The old man turned to face his grandson fully. I'd seen enough blood trails in my time to know this one. Not a kill shot. Not a gut wound that would drop someone fast. This was a bleeder from an arm or leg enough to weaken, but not enough to stop. Yet. The kind of wound that kills slow if you don't treat it. He sat back down slower this time, as if the weight of the memory pressed on him. I followed those tracks for another mile. The big boots stayed behind the small ones, never getting closer but never falling back. Like a cat playing with a mouse, like someone who had all the time in the world and was enjoying the chase. Samuel's hands curled into fists, the knuckles white even in the firelight. And then I saw something in the snow, a piece of cloth blue fabric torn. I picked it up. His voice cracked just slightly. It was a scarf, blue wool with a pattern of stars woven into it. Small yellow stars on dark blue, like a piece of night sky you could hold in your hands. He looked at David, and the boy saw tears gathering in the old man's eyes, though they didn't fall. That scarf, David. Margaret had one exactly like it. Made it herself the winter before she died. I'd buried her in it because she loved it so much. And here was another one identical in every way lying in the snow like a message from the grave. The fire hissed. The wind moaned. The world outside disappeared into white. I stood there holding that scarf, and something happened inside me. Something I can't quite explain even now. It felt like Margaret was there standing beside me, her hand on my shoulder. Felt like she was saying, "This is it, Samuel. This is the one. Keep your promise." Samuel picked up the carved bird again, held it up so the firelight shone through the thin wood of its wings. So I ran. 40 years old, carrying a rifle and running through 14 inches of snow like I was 20 again. The tracks got fresher. The blood got brighter. I could smell wood smoke on the air, could hear something ahead, and then I came over a rise and saw it. He paused the moment, stretching out. A creek bed frozen solid, and lying at the edge of it face down in the snow was a girl. Maybe 17, maybe younger, hard to tell. She wasn't moving. The snow around her was pink with blood, and standing 30 yards back watching her was a man. Samuel's voice went hard as winter iron. Big man, maybe 50 years old, face red from cold and drink. He had a shotgun, not the rifle I'd heard earlier. He was just standing there watching her lie there like he was waiting to see if she'd get up, like this was some kind of test. The old man's eyes narrowed. I could have shot him, had a clear line, could have put a bullet through him before he even knew I was there. Part of me wanted to, the war part. The part that still woke up at night with the taste of gunpowder in my mouth. He shook his head slowly. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped out where he could see me, raised my Winchester so there was no mistaking my intention, and I said the first words I'd spoken to another human being in maybe 3 weeks. Samuel's voice dropped into a different register, harder and colder. "That's far enough. Put the shotgun down and walk away." David's breath caught. What did he do? He looked at me, looked at the girl, then looked back at me. His face was all rage and whiskey and something else. Grief, maybe. Pain that had gone rotten. He raised the shotgun halfway, not quite pointing it at me, but not exactly friendly either. Samuel's finger tapped against his leg, a nervous gesture from a man who'd learned to control every movement. "She's mine," he said. His voice was rough, like he'd been shouting. "My daughter, my business. Walk away, old man." The word daughter hung in the air between past and present. I should have walked away. Wasn't my daughter, wasn't my business. Man had a legal right to do what he wanted with his own kin, more or less. Law didn't look too hard at what happened in families, especially out in the mountains where law was mostly theoretical anyway. Samuel's grip tightened on the carved bird. But I thought about Margaret, thought about the promise, thought about that scarf identical to the one I'd buried with my wife, and I thought about how I'd been dead for 3 years and didn't have much left to lose anyway. He met David's eyes. So I said, "Take another step toward her, and I'll drop you where you stand." The fire popped. Neither of them moved. We stood there in the snow, him, with his shotgun, half raised, me, with my Winchester pointed at his chest. The girl between us, not moving. The wind blowing. The snow falling. One of those moments where time slows down and you can see all the ways the next 10 seconds could go. Samuel's voice grew quieter. Then the man did something I didn't expect. He laughed. Not a happy laugh. A bitter, broken sound. He lowered the shotgun. And he said, "You want her, take her. She killed her mother, killed my wife. Might as well finish the job herself." The old man's face twisted. He turned and walked away. Just like that. Walked back the way he came, following his own tracks, and disappeared into the snow. I stood there, rifle still raised, not quite believing he'd actually gone. Samuel set the carved bird down with deliberate care. Then I heard it, a sound so small I almost missed it. A breath, shallow and ragged, but definitely a breath. She was alive. He closed his eyes, remembering. I got to her in maybe 5 seconds. Turned her over. Her face was blue with cold lips purple. She had bruises on her cheek, on her neck, finger marks on her throat where someone had tried to choke her. Her right hand was bleeding from where she'd grabbed a knife blade, probably trying to defend herself, and her feet, David. Her feet were bare, no shoes, just bloody prints in the snow. The image settled heavy in the room. I checked her pulse, 48 beats per minute, too slow, breathing shallow. Body temperature I guessed around 92 degrees. Hypothermia, stage 2, maybe 20 minutes from stage 3, which is when you don't come back. Samuel opened his eyes. I had a choice to make right then. The man who'd been chasing her, he knew where I'd come from. If I took her back to my cabin, he might come looking. Might bring trouble I didn't need. Might bring the kind of violence I'd promised myself I was done with after the war. His voice steadied. But then I looked down at her hand. She was still holding something, fingers clenched tight even though she was unconscious. I pried them open. It was a piece of cloth. Blue wool with yellow stars. The other half of the scarf I'd found. Samuel's throat worked. Margaret used to say there's no such thing as coincidence. Only providence you're not smart enough to recognize. I didn't know if I believed that, but I believed Margaret. And this felt like her reaching across death to remind me what it meant to be alive. He picked up the bird one more time. So I made the decision. I took off my coat, wrapped it around her, picked her up in a fireman's carry the way they taught us in the Army. She couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds, most of it bone, and I started walking. The wind rattled the windows again, and for a moment Samuel was back there in the snow carrying a dying girl through the wilderness. 2.7 miles back to my cabin. Took me 47 minutes. My old war wound opened up somewhere around mile 2, started bleeding through my shirt. Didn't matter. I'd carried dying men further than this. I could carry her. His voice grew rough. Got back to the cabin at 9:23. I know because I checked my pocket watch again. Habit. Kicked the door open, got her inside, got the fire built up high. Then I did what I should have done for Margaret, but didn't know how. Samuel looked at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. I stripped off her wet clothes, wrapped her in every blanket I had, put warm stones from the fire at her feet, made broth from venison and wild onion and yarrow to prevent infection, checked her injuries: 2 cracked ribs on the left side, frostbite on 4 toes, bruises everywhere, and that cut on her hand deep enough to need stitches. He demonstrated with his own hand, drawing a line across the palm. I used the salve Margaret had made from calendula and comfrey, used the surgical kit I'd kept from the war, did everything by the book, everything I'd learned from the field surgeons, everything I wished I'd known 3 years earlier. The old man's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and then I sat beside her bed and I prayed. First time I'd prayed since Margaret died. Didn't even know if I believed anymore. But I prayed anyway. Asked God to let me keep this promise. Asked Margaret to help if she could. Asked that girl to just keep breathing until morning. Samuel looked up at David, and the firelight caught the wetness in his eyes. At 11:45 that night there was a knock at my door. David jumped slightly. Samuel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I knew who it was before I opened it. Picked up my Winchester, made sure it was loaded, opened the door just wide enough to see out. His voice hardened. The man from the woods stood there, even bigger up close, maybe 6'1", 220 pounds, face flushed with alcohol and rage. He had a shotgun in his hands, and this time it was pointed at me. Samuel's finger tapped again. 1, 2, 3. "I want my daughter back," he said. "William Hayes, that was his name, though I didn't know it yet. She's mine. You got no right." The old man's jaw set. I told him I hadn't seen anyone, told him to check somewhere else, told him a lot of things that were lies, first real lies I'd told since the war. He paused. He didn't believe me, pushed past me, tried to get into the cabin. I stopped him, put the rifle barrel against his chest and pushed back, and I said something I meant with every fiber of my being. Samuel's voice went cold as the December night outside. I said, "You take one more step and I will kill you, not wound you, not stop you, kill you, and I've killed enough men to know exactly how to do it quick." The fire crackled, the moment stretched. He looked at me, really looked, saw something in my eyes, I guess, something from the war, something that told him I wasn't bluffing. He backed up, slowly, kept the shotgun raised but backed up anyway. Samuel's shoulders sagged slightly. "You're making a mistake," he said. "She'll bring you nothing but trouble. Killed her mother, she did, day she was born. Cursed." The old man shook his head. Then he left, walked back into the snow. But before he went, he said one more thing. "I'll be back. This ain't over." Samuel set the bird down between them again. I stood in that doorway for maybe 10 minutes after he left, just stood there, rifle in hand, watching the snow cover his tracks, wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life, wondering if I should have just let nature take its course. He looked at David. But then I went back inside, back to that girl lying in my bed wrapped in blankets, breathing shallow but breathing. And I knew, mistake or not, I'd made my choice. I'd keep the promise. The old man's voice softened. She didn't wake up for 36 hours. I sat with her the whole time, changed the warm stones, spooned broth into her mouth when she'd swallow, kept the fire going, and I talked to her. David's eyebrows rose. "What did you say?" Told her about Margaret, about Thomas, about the war, about everything I'd never told another living soul. Figured she couldn't hear me anyway, so what did it matter? Turns out dying people hear more than you think. Samuel smiled, a real smile this time. Day 2, around 10 in the morning, her eyes opened. Just a crack at first, like the light hurt, then wider. She looked around the cabin, saw me sitting there, and the first thing she did was scream. He nodded at David's shocked expression. Can't blame her. She woke up in a strange place with a strange man. All she knew was fear, all she'd ever known probably. So she tried to get up, tried to run, broke those cracked ribs all over again, fell on the floor screaming. Samuel's face grew gentle. I didn't move, didn't go to her, just raised my hands where she could see them. And I said as calm as I could, "You're safe. I won't hurt you." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. She didn't believe me. Why would she? So I just sat there, kept my hands up, kept my distance, let her see that I wasn't going to force anything. And slowly, very slowly, her breathing started to calm. Samuel's eyes grew distant again. It took a week before she spoke to me. A week of me bringing food and leaving it across the room. A week of me sleeping in the chair by the fire instead of my own bed. A week of me proving bit by bit that my word meant something. He looked at the carved bird. On day 7, she finally asked a question, just 3 words. "Where is he?" Samuel's voice dropped. I knew who she meant. Told her the truth. Told her I'd sent him away. Told her he wouldn't bother her here. Told her she could leave whenever she wanted, but while she stayed she was under my protection. The old man's throat worked. She looked at me for a long time, really looked. Then she said 4 more words. "My name is Clara." Samuel picked up the carved bird one last time. And that, David, is when I started carving this. Started the night she told me her name. Took me 3 months to finish. Every night sitting by the fire while she healed, I worked on it. Gave me something to do with my hands. Gave me something to focus on besides wondering if I'd done the right thing. He held it up to the light. Mountain laurel. Same wood Margaret used to love. Carved it into a bluebird because that's what Margaret said Thomas should have been called if he'd lived. Our little bluebird. Never got to sing. The tears finally fell 2 tracks down the weathered face. But Clara, she sang. Not with her voice, not at first, but with her life, with her healing, with the way she started to trust again, bit by bit. She sang the song Margaret never got to hear. She became the promise I kept. Samuel set the bird down gently. That's why this bird matters, David, because it marks the moment I stopped being dead and started being alive again. The moment I learned that keeping a promise isn't just about honoring the past. It's about building the future. The fire burned low. The snow kept falling, and in the silence that followed, David understood why his grandfather had waited so many years to tell this story. Some truths are too heavy to carry alone. Some promises are too important to forget. But the night was far from over, and the story was just beginning. Samuel Winters shifted in his chair, the firelight catching the deep lines around his eyes. Outside, the Missouri snow continued its relentless fall, but inside the old man was 42 years and 1,000 miles away. David hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Some stories demanded silence. That first week with Clara, Samuel continued, his voice settling back into the rhythm of remembering, I learned what it meant to earn trust 1 minute at a time. She'd wake up screaming most nights, nightmares. I'd hear her through the wall, hear her crying out for her mother, begging someone to stop. I never went in, just sat outside her door and talked through the wood. Told her where she was, told her she was safe. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. He reached for his coffee, long gone cold, but held the cup anyway. The warmth was a memory, but memories sometimes sufficed. By the end of that first month, she could walk without crying out from the ribs. The frostbite healed, though she'd always have scars on those toes. The cut on her hand closed up clean, but the inside injuries, those took longer. Those are still healing, probably wherever she is now. David opened his mouth to ask, but Samuel held up a hand. I'm getting there, boy. Patience. A story told right has its own pace. The old man set down the cup. February of 1879, 3 months after I'd found her. Clara had started helping around the cabin. Nothing I asked for, just things she did. Mending my shirts, organizing the shelves where I kept the medical supplies Margaret had left, cooking meals that were more than just meat and cornbread. Little things. But they mattered. Made the cabin feel less like a tomb and more like a home. Samuel's eyes grew distant. One evening I was working on the bluebird carving sitting by the fire. Clara was reading one of Margaret's old books, a collection of poetry. We'd fallen into this habit of quiet together, comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. Then she spoke. His voice softened, taking on a younger woman's cadence. She said, "That scarf, the blue one with stars. My mother made 2 of them, one for herself, one for me. She said stars were promises from God that morning always comes no matter how dark the night gets." Samuel nodded slowly. I told her about Margaret, about how my wife had the same scarf, about how Catherine, her mother, had come to this very cabin 17 years before pregnant and running from William, about how Margaret had helped deliver Clara right here in that back room during a storm even worse than the one the night I found her. The fire crackled. The moment hung between past and present. Clara went pale, asked me if I was certain. I showed her Margaret's journal. My wife had documented everything, every birth she attended, every healing she performed. There it was, dated April 7th, 1861. Catherine Hayes, female child, 7 pounds 2 ounces, difficult labor breech position. Mother and child survived. Samuel's voice grew thick. Clara read that entry 3 times. Then she looked at me and said, "So this place saved me twice. Once when I was born, once when I was dying." And I told her the truth. I said, "No, you saved this place. You saved me." The old man cleared his throat, the emotion still raw after all these years. That night we talked until the fire burned down to embers. She told me about her life with William, how he'd been different before Catherine died, how her mother's death in childbirth 15 years after Clara's own birth had broken something in him, how he blamed Clara for everything, said she'd cursed the family, how the beating started small and grew worse, how she'd learned to read his moods by the sound of his footsteps, the smell of whiskey on his breath, the way he closed the cabin door. Samuel's hands curled into fists. And I told her about the war, about Cold Harbor and all the blood, about the men I'd killed and the men I'd watched die, about the parts of myself I'd left on those battlefields. We traded scars that night, her and me. Not the kind you can see, but the kind that run deeper. He looked at David. That's when we became family. Not by blood, but by choice, by understanding, by the simple fact that we'd both survived things that should have killed us and decided that surviving meant something. The wind rattled the windows. Samuel waited for it to pass. Spring came late that year. Snow didn't clear until mid-April. During those months I taught Clara everything Margaret had taught me. How to identify 127 different plants, which ones healed and which ones killed. How to set a broken bone. How to stitch a wound. How to read the weather by the color of the sky and the behavior of birds. How to track deer and set snares and field dress game. His voice took on a harder edge. But I also taught her things Margaret never knew. Military things. How to hold a knife so you could disable a man without killing him. How to shoot the Winchester accounting for wind and distance, how to move through the woods without making a sound, how to survive. Samuel's jaw tightened, because I knew William Hayes was still out there, and men like him don't forget, don't forgive. They wait, they plan, and eventually they come back. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at the snow-covered Missouri landscape that was nothing like the Virginia mountains he was describing. I was right to worry, but the threat when it came wasn't from the direction I expected. The old man turned back to face his grandson. May 10th, 1879. I was checking my traps about 2 miles east of the cabin. Clara was home practicing her shooting. I heard her fire off maybe 6 rounds, getting better each time. Good rhythm, good spacing. She'd become an excellent shot. Samuel's expression darkened. Then I saw them, boot prints in the mud. Fresh, maybe an hour old, 3 sets, big men, heavy tread. They'd come from the south, skirted around the cabin at a distance like they were surveying, and every 100 yards or so they'd hammered something into the ground. He mimed the action, driving an invisible stake. Survey markers, wooden stakes with numbers carved into them. I followed the trail of stakes for half a mile. Each one had the same inscription: Whitmore Land Company, Parcel 47. David frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Samuel said, settling back into his chair, "that someone thought they owned my land, Someone with lawyers and paperwork and the kind of power that doesn't care about a man who's lived somewhere for 8 years. The old man's voice went flat. I went back to the cabin, told Clara what I'd found. She went quiet the way she did when she was thinking hard. Then she asked me a question I should have asked myself years ago. She said, "Do you have a deed, legal papers proving this land is yours?" Samuel shook his head. I didn't. When Margaret and I came here in 1869, this was unclaimed wilderness. We built the cabin, worked the land, lived our lives. Figured that was enough. But the law doesn't care about living somewhere. It cares about paper, about documents and surveys and official stamps. His hand spread in a gesture of helplessness. We didn't have to wait long to find out what it meant. 2 days later they came. 3 men on horseback, dressed too well for the mountains. The leader was maybe 35, clean-shaven, carrying a leather satchel. The other 2 were hired muscle, the kind of men who get paid to look dangerous. Samuel's eyes narrowed. The leader's name was Jack Morrison. He dismounted, all polite smiles and professional courtesy, and introduced himself as a land agent for the Whitmore Settlement Company. Said they'd recently acquired the rights to this parcel and several others in the area. Said I had 14 days to vacate the premises. The old man's voice hardened. I told him I'd been living here for 9 years. Told him I'd built this cabin with my own hands. Told him my wife was buried here and my son. Jack Morrison just smiled that professional smile and said, "I understand, Mr. Winters, truly, but the law is clear. No deed means no rights. I'm sure you understand." Samuel stood again, too agitated to sit. Then he asked about Clara. "Saw her through the window, I suppose. Asked if she was my daughter. I lied. Said she was my niece staying temporarily." He looked at her a long time, that smile never reaching his eyes, then turned back to me. The old man's voice dropped. He said, 14 days, Mr. Winters. After that, we'll have to take more decisive action. For everyone's safety, you understand." Then he and his men rode off. Samuel paced to the mantel, picked up the photograph of Margaret, stared at it. Clara came outside after they left. We stood there together watching the dust settle. Then she said something that changed everything. She said, "We have to find out where they got the rights to this land. Someone had to sell it to them." He set the photograph down. That night I couldn't sleep. Sat up thinking about William Hayes, about how he'd been chasing Clara, about how he'd known where my cabin was, about the timing of everything. And around 3 in the morning I realized. Samuel turned to face David. Next day I rode into the nearest town, place called Greenville, about 15 miles south. Went to the county recorder's office. Asked to see the land transfer documents for Parcel 47. His voice went quiet. William Hayes had sold a map of the entire region to the Whitmore Company about 2 weeks before I found Clara. Sold it for $47, enough to pay his whiskey debts. The clerk told me William had died the night after he came to my cabin, the very same night he left, threatening to come back. They found his body at the bottom of a ravine the next morning, neck broken, bottle still in his hand. The fall happened less than a mile from my cabin. He must have been drunk with rage when he left me stumbled in the dark. The silence in the room was absolute. Clara's father had been dead the whole time, dead before I even knew her name. He'd chased her into the woods, tried to kill her, then gone home and drunk himself to death within 48 hours. Samuel sat back down heavily. I rode home and told Clara. Thought she'd cry or show some kind of emotion, but she just sat there staring at the fire. Finally she said, "I don't feel anything. Should I feel something?" And I told her the truth. I said, "Some deaths don't deserve tears. Some men live so wrong that their dying is just a mercy to everyone they hurt." The old man rubbed his face with both hands. But William's death didn't solve our problem. The Whitmore Company still had legal claim to the land. Jack Morrison still expected us gone in 12 days. He looked at his grandson. That's when Clara made a decision that terrified me. She said she was going to Greenville, going to talk to Benjamin Fletcher, the owner of the Whitmore Company, going to fight for our home. Samuel's voice rose. I told her it was too dangerous. She was 17 years old, barely healed, going to face down a businessman with the law on his side. But Clara, she'd learned something living with me those 5 months. She'd learned that sometimes the only way through fear is straight ahead. The old man's throat worked. We argued. First real argument we'd had. She said she had to do this, had to prove she could stand up for herself, for us, for the home we'd built. And finally, I understood. This wasn't about the land. This was about Clara choosing to fight instead of run. This was about her taking back the power William had stolen. Samuel nodded slowly. So I taught her what to say, how to negotiate, how to present herself, and I wrote a letter to Fletcher, told him about Margaret saving his sister from diphtheria in 1869, asked for 60 days to prepare a legal case, reminded him that honor meant more than profit even in business. He smiled, but it was sad. Then I gave Clara $47, every cent I had saved, gave her the letter, gave her the carved bluebird still unfinished, and I watched her walk down that mountain path heading toward a world I couldn't protect her from. The fire had burned low. Samuel added another log, the flames catching and growing. Worst 5 days of my life. Worse than waiting for battle. Worse than watching Margaret die. Because at least in war and death you know the enemy. But Clara was walking into a world of contracts and lawyers and men who smiled while they ruined you. He settled back into his chair. Day 3 of her being gone, Jack Morrison came back. This time he wasn't polite. This time he had 6 men with him, all armed. They rode right up to my cabin, and Jack demanded to know where Clara was. Samuel's voice went cold. I told him she'd left, gone to stay with family elsewhere. He didn't believe me. Had his men search the cabin while I stood there with my Winchester counting the odds. 6 against 1. I'd faced worse during the war, but I'd been younger then, faster. The old man's jaw set. They didn't find her, of course. But before they left, Jack gave me a new deadline. 7 days instead of 14. Said if I wasn't gone by then, they'd burn the cabin. Make sure I had nothing to come back to. He looked at David. I spent those 3 days waiting for Clara, preparing for war. Cleaned every gun I owned. Counted ammunition. Reinforced the door and windows. Set tripwires around the perimeter. If they wanted this cabin, they'd have to kill me for it. And I'd already died once. Wasn't afraid of doing it again. Samuel's hands trembled slightly. On the evening of day 5, Clara came back. His voice softened. I heard her coming up the path, recognized her footsteps. Rushed outside, and there she was. Alive. Whole. But different somehow. She walked taller. Looked me in the eye in a way she hadn't before. And she was smiling. The old man smiled too, remembering. She'd done it. Clara had met with Benjamin Fletcher, told him about Margaret, about me, about everything, and Fletcher he remembered. Remembered his sister Sarah, 12 years old, burning up with diphtheria. Remembered Margaret sitting with her for 3 days and nights, using herbs and prayer and sheer determination to bring the fever down. Remembered his sister living when everyone said she'd die. Samuel's voice grew stronger. Fletcher made Clara an offer. He'd protect our land, put it in writing, make it legal. But in exchange, Clara had to work for him, not as a servant, but as a mediator. Someone who understood both the mountain people and the settlers. Someone who could solve disputes before they turned violent. The old man leaned forward. Clara took the deal, but she negotiated. Said she needed 1 month of training before starting officially. Said Fletcher had to provide the land deed immediately, not after she proved herself. Said she'd work from the cabin, not from town, so she could still care for me. Pride filled Samuel's voice. Fletcher agreed to everything. Drew up the papers right there. Clara Hayes, age 17, was now a legal mediator for the Whitmore Settlement Company at $12 a month. And Samuel Winters, age 40, was now the legal owner of 8 acres of Blue Ridge mountain land with a cabin, a well, and 2 graves that would never be disturbed. He sat back. I hugged her. First time I'd hugged anyone since Margaret died. Held her like a father holds a daughter. And I told her I was proud. Told her she'd become stronger than she knew. Told her Margaret would have loved her. The moment stretched warm despite the winter cold outside. But our troubles weren't over. Jack Morrison didn't take the news well. Samuel's expression darkened. 2 nights after Clara returned, they came. 2 in the morning. I heard them before I saw them. Boot steps, multiple sets, whispered voices, men who thought they were being quiet but weren't. His voice dropped into the cadence of action. I woke Clara, whispered for her to get the spare rifle. We took positions, me at the front door, her at the window. 3 men outside, Jack Morrison and 2 others. They weren't there to talk. The old man's eyes grew hard. First one through was Pete, one of Jack's hired guns. He kicked the door. I'd reinforced it, but it splintered anyway. He came through with a pistol raised. I shot him. Winchester round through the shoulder, spinning him around and down. Not a kill shot. Never aimed to kill unless I had to. Samuel's hands moved, remembering the motions. Second man Dutch, he tried the window where Clara was positioned. She fired a warning shot 6 inches from his head. He dropped flat, crawled away. Good instincts on her part. Could have killed him. Chose not to. The old man's voice tightened. Then Jack threw something through the broken door. A torch. Lit rag wrapped around a stick. It landed on my floor, caught the rug Margaret had woven. Fire spread fast. I had maybe 30 seconds before the whole cabin went up. He closed his eyes, seeing it again. I had to choose. Stay and fight or save the cabin. I chose the cabin. Rushed to the water barrel, started throwing buckets on the fire. That's when Jack came through the door. Samuel's voice went flat. He hit me from behind, rifle stock to the back of the head. I went down. My Winchester skittered across the floor. Jack stood over me, his face twisted with rage and something else, humiliation. Fletcher had overruled him, made him look weak in front of his men. The old man's hands curled. He raised the rifle stock again, aimed for my head, would have caved my skull in, but Clara screamed. Not a scream of fear, a scream of fury. She threw herself at him, all 90 pounds of righteous anger. Pride crept back into Samuel's voice. Jack backbanded her, sent her sprawling. That's when something broke inside me. Not broke like damaged. Broke like a dam giving way. All the rage I'd kept locked down since the war, all the violence I'd promised Margaret I'd leave behind, it came flooding back. His voice went quiet and dangerous. I got up. Don't remember standing. Don't remember crossing the room. But suddenly I had Jack by the throat, my hands around his windpipe, squeezing. His face went red, then purple. His eyes bulged. And I wanted him dead. Wanted it more than I'd wanted anything in years. Samuel's hands shook. I had him on the ground. Knife in my hand, the one I used for field dressing deer, pressed against his throat. One stroke and it would be over. One cut and the threat would end. And I'd done it before. Cold Harbor, 7 Union prisoners, orders from command, quick cuts, efficient. I knew exactly how. The old man's voice cracked. Then Clara spoke. Through her split lip, through her fear, she said, "Samuel, stop. You promised Margaret you wouldn't become this. You promised." He opened his eyes and they were wet. I stopped. Hand shaking so bad I could barely hold the knife. But I stopped. Released Jack's throat. Let him breathe. Told him to get out. Told him to tell Fletcher what happened. Told him I didn't kill anymore. Samuel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. They left, Pete bleeding from his shoulder, Dutch terrified, Jack gasping for air. They rode off into the night, and I sat on the floor of my cabin surrounded by smoke and broken furniture and the smell of gunpowder, and I shook like a leaf. The old man looked at David. Clara came to me, sat beside me, put her arms around me, and we stayed like that until dawn. 2 broken people holding each other together. He stood, paced to the window again. That night I told her everything. About the war, about Cold Harbor, about the 7 men I'd executed, about the boy who'd asked me to tell his mother he'd been brave, about how their faces came to me in nightmares, about how I'd promised Margaret I'd never kill again, but came so close to breaking that promise. Samuel's voice grew rough. Clara listened to every word. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said, You didn't break the promise. That's what matters. You were strong enough to stop. That's harder than killing. That's real courage." The old man turned back to his grandson. Fletcher came himself the next day, brought a doctor for Pete's shoulder, apologized for Jack's actions, fired Jack Morrison on the spot, and he offered Clara something new. Samuel sat back down. He said the mediator job was still hers if she wanted it, but he understood if she wanted to stay on the mountain, stay away from town, said he couldn't blame her. The old man's voice softened. Clara looked at me, then looked at Fletcher, and she said she'd take the job, said she'd start in 2 weeks, said the mountain would always be home, but she needed to do this, needed to prove she could walk in both worlds. Samuel nodded slowly. So that's what she did. For the next 3 months, Clara would spend weekdays in Greenville working as a mediator, solving disputes over water rights and fence lines and grazing land. Then every Friday evening she'd come home. We'd spend the weekend together. She'd tell me about the cases. I'd teach her more about medicine and survival. And slowly, our routine became a life. His expression clouded. But that summer I started coughing. Nothing serious at first, just a tickle in my throat. By August there was blood in my handkerchief. By September I knew what it was. The old man's voice went flat. Tuberculosis. Likely caught during the war, dormant for 15 years. The doctor in Greenville confirmed it. Said I had maybe 6 months, maybe 18 if I was lucky. No cure, just time. He looked at the fire. I didn't tell Clara for 2 weeks. Didn't know how. She'd lost everyone. Her mother, her father in the worst possible way, and now me. But she noticed. Of course she noticed. Found my bloody handkerchiefs. Confronted me. Samuel's throat worked. I told her the truth. Showed her what the doctor had written. Expected tears, expected anger. Got neither. Clara just looked at me with those eyes that had seen too much and said, "Then we make the most of the time we have. You teach me everything. I learn everything. And when you're gone, I keep the promise alive." The old man's voice grew thick. So that's what we did. Every weekend became a lesson. Every conversation became a memory worth keeping. She wrote everything down in journals, my medical knowledge, my tracking techniques, my stories about Margaret, my regrets, and my wisdom, and my terrible jokes. He smiled through the tears. Clara became more than a daughter to me. She became my legacy. The proof that keeping a promise mattered. The proof that even a dead man could come back to life if he found the right reason. Samuel picked up the carved bluebird one more time. By October, I'd finished this. 347 hours of work spread over 8 months. Every feather carved individually, every detail perfect. I gave it to Clara on her 18th birthday. Told her it represented everything Margaret had wanted for our son. Freedom, joy, the ability to fly. He set it down gently. Clara cried when I gave it to her. First tears I'd seen from her in months. She held it like it was made of glass, and she promised me something. She said, "When I find someone who needs this more than me, I'll pass it on, the way you passed Margaret's promise to me." The fire burned steady. The snow kept falling, and Samuel Winters, 82 years old and counting his own remaining days, looked at his grandson. That winter was hard. My cough got worse. The blood came more often, but Clara never left. She quit her job with Fletcher, came back to the cabin full-time, took care of me the way I'd taken care of her. His voice dropped to a whisper, and in those final months before I knew I was dying, she showed me what love really meant. Not the romantic kind, not even the family kind exactly, but the kind of love that says, "You saved me, so I'll stay with you until the end." Samuel looked at David, really looked at him. February of 1880, almost a year after Clara had started working as a mediator. The coughing had gotten so bad I could barely speak, but I needed to say one more thing, needed to make sure she understood. The old man's voice steadied. I called in the lawyer from Greenville, had him draw up my will, left everything to Clara, the cabin, the land, the 8 acres, the graves, everything. Fletcher came as a witness, signed the papers himself. He paused. Clara tried to refuse, said I might still have years. I told her the truth. I said I might, but I also might not. And if I don't, this land needs someone who'll protect it, someone who'll honor what Margaret and I built here. That's you, Clara. It's always been you." Samuel's hands trembled. She took the deed, held it like a sacred thing, and she made me another promise. She said, "I'll protect this place. I'll help people the way you helped me, and I'll never forget what you taught me about second chances." The old man wiped his eyes again. "That's where we were in February of 1880. Me dying slowly, Clara living fully, our cabin standing strong against whatever the world threw at it, and a promise started by Margaret and kept by me passing to the next generation." He looked at the carved bluebird between them. "But the story doesn't end there, David, not even close. Because what I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that keeping one promise would lead to another, and another, until it became something bigger than any of us." Samuel settled deeper into his chair, the firelight playing across his weathered face. The real test was still coming, the moment when Clara would have to decide if everything I'd taught her was enough to stand on her own. He looked at his grandson. "You ready to hear about that?" David nodded, unable to speak. And Samuel Winters, keeper of promises and guardian of second chances, continued his story into the deep winter night. The Mountain's Promise, Part 3, Legacy and Circle. The fire had burned down to embers again. Samuel Winters added another log, watching the flames catch and grow, the light dancing across the walls like spirits from a time long past. David sat motionless, barely breathing, as if any sound might shatter the spell his grandfather was weaving. Spring of 1879 came late to the mountains. Samuel continued his voice, taking on the weight of those final seasons. Snow held on through March. April brought rain that turned the trails to mud. But May, when it finally arrived, brought warmth and new green growth and the smell of earth waking up after a long sleep. He shifted in his chair, the old wood creaking beneath him. I knew by then that I was dying. The tuberculosis had moved from my lungs into my bones. Every breath hurt. Every movement cost me. The doctor in Greenville had revised his estimate. 6 months, he said. Maybe less. It was May. That gave me until November if I was lucky. Samuel's hands rested on his knees, still strong despite the years, despite the story he was telling. But those months, David, those months were the fullest of my life. Not the happiest, maybe, not the easiest, but the most complete, because I knew they mattered. Every day was a gift I could give Clara. Every lesson was something she'd carry forward. Every story was a piece of me that wouldn't die when my body did. The old man's eyes grew distant. I made a catalog, wrote down everything I knew about the 127 medicinal plants that grew within 10 miles of the cabin, which leaves to pick in spring, which roots to harvest in fall, how to prepare salves and tinctures and poultices, the exact measurements Margaret had used, the ones that had saved Sarah Fletcher's life, and dozens of others. He tapped his temple. All of it was up here. I put it on paper, drew diagrams, made notes in the margins about things I'd learned through trial and error. 3 journals by the time I finished. Clara copied them herself, made duplicates in case something happened to the originals. Smart girl, always thinking ahead. Samuel stood, walked to the window, looked out at the Missouri snow that kept falling. I mapped the land too. Every water source within 50 square miles. Every cave that could serve as shelter, every dangerous cliff and hidden sinkhole, every game trail and berry patch and stand of useful timber. Drew it all out in detail, marked distances, noted landmarks, made sure Clara would know that land the way I did. His voice grew softer. And I taught her to fight. Really fight. Not the basic knife work I'd shown her before, but the techniques that kept me alive through 4 years of war. Where to cut to disable without killing, how to read an opponent's body language before they moved, how to use size against someone bigger, how to survive. Samuel turned back to David. She practiced every day, got good too, Fast hands, good instincts. By June she could disarm me 3 times out of 5, and I'd been a soldier when she was still unborn. But more important than the technique, I taught her the mindset. When to fight and when to walk away. When mercy was strength and when it was foolishness. The hard lessons that only come from living through violence. The old man sat back down the movement slower than before, the 82 years showing through. July brought a lawyer from Greenville. Man named Thomas Whitfield, sent by Benjamin Fletcher himself. He carried papers, legal documents. I knew what they were before he opened his satchel. Samuel's voice steadied. Fletcher was offering to buy the land. Fair price, more than fair, actually. $300 for 8 acres, the cabin, everything. Enough money for Clara to start a new life somewhere civilized, somewhere she wouldn't have to fight for every day. The lawyer presented it like he was doing us a favor. A smile ghosted across the old man's face. I told him no. Told him the land wasn't for sale at any price. The lawyer looked confused, started to argue. That's when Clara spoke up. She'd been sitting quiet in the corner listening. She said, "This land holds 3 graves, my mother's memory, Samuel's promise. Those things don't have a price." Pride filled Samuel's voice. The lawyer tried one more time, said Fletcher just wanted to help, said he was worried about what would happen to Clara after I died. Clara looked him dead in the eye and said, "Tell Mr. Fletcher I appreciate his concern, but I'll be fine. This is my home. I'm not leaving." The old man nodded slowly. The lawyer left, came back 2 days later with different papers. These ones Fletcher had prepared himself. A deed. Clean title to the 8 acres registered in Clara's name. Legal and binding. Fletcher had done it without asking, without payment. Just did it because it was right. Samuel's throat worked. The note that came with the deed said, "Your mother saved my sister. You saved my conscience. The land is yours. No one will take it from you." Fletcher kept his word. That deed still exists. I've seen it. Signed and sealed and registered in the Virginia Land Office. He looked at David. That was my gift to Clara. Not the land itself, but the security of knowing it couldn't be taken. The freedom to stay or go as she chose. The power to make her own decisions about her own life. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. August, September, October. The months ran together like water. I got weaker, started coughing up more blood than air, lost weight until my clothes hung loose. Clara tried to hide how scared she was. I tried to hide how much pain I was in. We were both terrible at pretending. Samuel's voice dropped, but we made the most of it. Every evening we'd sit by the fire. She'd read to me from Margaret's books. I'd tell her stories about the war, about my childhood, about things I'd never told anyone. We'd play chess on the board I'd carved years ago. She always won. I was proud of that. The old man's hands trembled slightly. November 17th, 1879. I woke up that morning and knew. Don't ask me how, I just knew today was the day. The pain was different. Not worse exactly, just final, like my body was saying goodbye to itself. His voice grew steady despite the emotion. I asked Clara to help me dress, put on my good shirt, the one I'd worn when I married Margaret. Asked her to help me walk outside. It took us 20 minutes to cross the 100 yards to the graves. I had to stop 4 times to catch my breath, but we made it. Samuel closed his eyes, seeing it. I sat there by Margaret's grave, by Thomas's, talked to them like they could hear, told Margaret I'd kept my promise, told her Clara was safe, was strong, was everything our son might have been if he'd lived, told them both I'd be seeing them soon. A single tear traced down the weathered face. Clara sat with me, held my hand, didn't say anything, didn't need to. We stayed there for 2 hours, watching the sky, listening to the wind in the pines, just being. The old man opened his eyes. When we went back inside, I was done. Knew I wouldn't leave that bed again. Clara helped me lie down, covered me with the quilt Margaret had made, the one with blue stars on gold like the scarf Catherine had woven, everything connected, everything circular. Samuel's voice grew hoarse. I told Clara one last thing. Said, everything happens for a reason. Your mother came here. Margaret saved you both. Margaret died. I made a promise. William chased you. You ran to exactly the right place. I saved you. You saved me. It's all connected, all part of something bigger than we can see." He swallowed hard. "Clara said, you'll always be with me, in everything you taught me, in every person I help. You're not dying, Samuel. You're multiplying." The old man's voice broke. At 4:23 that afternoon I died. Peaceful, no pain at the end. Last thing I saw was Clara's face. Last thing I heard was her voice saying, "Thank you, for everything." Last thing I felt was her hand holding mine. Samuel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "She stayed with me until dawn." Mountain tradition. You don't leave the dead alone their first night. She washed my body, dressed me in my cavalry uniform, the one I'd stored in a trunk since the war, sat vigil all night telling me stories the way I'd told her. The fire crackled in the silence. The funeral was 3 days later. 47 people came. Mountain folk who'd known me for years. Settlers Clara had helped mediate for. Benjamin Fletcher himself rode up from Greenville. They buried me between Margaret and Thomas. Family together at last. Samuel's voice steadied. Fletcher spoke at the service, talked about duty and honor and keeping promises. But Clara, she spoke last. I wasn't there to hear it, of course. But people told me what she said. He recited from memory words he'd heard retold 100 times. She said, "Samuel Winters taught me that strength isn't about never falling. It's about standing back up. He taught me that family isn't blood. It's choice. He taught me that one person keeping one promise can change the world. He saved my life. Then he taught me how to live it. That's what I'll remember. That's what I'll pass on." The old man looked at David. "And she did pass it on, but I'm getting ahead of myself." He settled deeper into his chair. Winter of 1879 to 1880. Clara stayed at the cabin, alone for the first time in her life, really alone. But she didn't hide, didn't retreat. She expanded. Samuel's voice grew stronger, telling a story he knew secondhand, but treasured nonetheless. She turned the cabin into a clinic, small at first, just treating the occasional mountain family who couldn't afford a doctor, stitching wounds, setting bones, delivering babies, using everything I'd taught her, everything Margaret had known. Pride filled every word. Word spread. By spring of 1880 people were coming from 20 miles away. Clara Hayes, they called her. The mountain healer. The one who didn't charge if you couldn't pay. The one who'd sit with you all night if that's what it took. The one who understood suffering because she'd survived it. The old man smiled. Fletcher heard about it. Came back with another offer. Wanted Clara to be the official medical provider for all Whitmore settlements. Good salary, supplies, everything she needed. But Clara negotiated. Said she'd do it, but only from the cabin, only on her terms, only if people could come to her instead of her going to them. Samuel nodded. Fletcher agreed, set her up proper, medical supplies, books, equipment, even built a small addition to the cabin, turned it into a real clinic. Clara was 20 years old and running a medical practice that served 3 counties. His voice took on the cadence of years passing. 1881, 1882, 1883, the years rolled by. Clara never married. Men asked, of course. She was beautiful, capable, owned land. But she always said no, told them she had a different calling, told them love took many forms and hers was healing. The old man's eyes grew distant. 1883 brought diphtheria, outbreak that killed 20 children in the valley. Clara worked for 6 weeks straight, barely slept, used every technique Margaret had documented, every treatment that had saved Sarah Fletcher years before, saved 12 lives, lost 8, wept for every one she couldn't save. Samuel's voice grew reverent. That's when Fletcher did something remarkable. He created a foundation, called it the Winters Foundation, funded it himself, made Clara the director. Its mission was simple: provide medical care and land mediation to anyone who needed it regardless of ability to pay. The old man spread his hands. Clara ran that foundation for 27 years, trained 3 assistants, resolved over 200 land disputes, delivered 47 babies, saved countless lives. All from that cabin in the mountains, all based on what one dead soldier taught one scared girl about keeping promises. He looked at the fire, watching the flames dance. But the real test came in 1903. May 14th, Clara was 42 years old, established, respected, living a good life. That's when there was a knock at her door. Samuel's voice dropped. A girl stood there, 16 years old, bruises on her arms, terror in her eyes, clothes torn, barefoot, bleeding. Clara took one look and saw herself 24 years earlier. The old man leaned forward. The girl's name was Emma Price. She'd run from her father, run through the woods just like Clara had, run until she couldn't run anymore. Someone had told her about the woman in the mountain cabin who helped people, so she ran there. Samuel's voice grew gentle. Clara brought her inside, gave her blankets, gave her soup, gave her the exact same words I'd given Clara. You're safe. I won't hurt you. Emma broke down crying, said her father had been beating her for years, said he'd threatened to kill her that morning, said she had nowhere else to go. The old man's voice strengthened. Clara treated her wounds, let her rest, didn't push, didn't pry, just provided safety and let Emma talk when she was ready. Over the next days and weeks, Clara did for Emma exactly what I'd done for her. Taught her skills, built her confidence, showed her she had value. He paused. 6 months later, Clara gave Emma something. The carved bluebird, the one I'd made, the one Clara had kept for 24 years. She told Emma the whole story, about Margaret, about me, about promises and second chances. And she said, "Keep this until you don't need it anymore. Then pass it to someone who does." Samuel's throat worked. Emma cried, asked if Clara was sure. Clara said, "I've held it long enough. Time to let it fly." The old man's voice grew quiet. What Clara didn't know, what she found out later, was that Emma's last name was Price, her mother's maiden name, the one the girl had taken after her mother fled from James. But Emma's father's birth name was James Winters, my nephew, my brother's son, a man I'd mentioned once to Clara years ago, called him a bad seed in a good family. He shook his head slowly. The circle was tighter than anyone knew. Emma was family, distant but family, and Clara had saved her without knowing the connection. Proof that keeping promises spreads like ripples in water touching shores you never intended. Samuel stood, walked to the mantel, picked up the carved bluebird. Emma stayed with Clara for 3 years, learned everything Clara could teach her. Then she left, went to nursing school in Richmond, became a proper nurse. But she came back every summer, helped at the clinic. And in 1910, when Clara was 49 years old and dying of the same tuberculosis that killed me, Emma was there. The old man's voice cracked. Clara died like I did, peaceful, surrounded by love. Her last act was to make Emma promise something, promise to keep the clinic open, promise to help others, promise to pass the bluebird on when the time was right. He held up the wooden bird, let the firelight shine through it. Emma kept that promise, ran the clinic for 15 years. Then in 1925 she passed the bluebird to another girl. That girl passed it to another, and another. 5 women total, all saved, all healed, all taught to help others. Samuel turned to face David. The 5th woman, her name was Ruth Calloway. In 1918, when she was 23 and had learned everything the previous woman could teach her, she did something unexpected. She tracked me down. I was 80 years old, living here in Missouri. I'd left Virginia after Clara died, couldn't bear to stay in the mountains without her. Thought I'd live out my days quiet. Then Ruth showed up at my door with the bluebird in her hands. His voice grew thick. She said, "Clara told Emma to tell whoever held this last to bring it back to you. She said your work wasn't done. She said you'd know what to do." Samuel sat back down, cradling the bird. I didn't know what to do. I was old tired, thought my time for making a difference was past. But Ruth, she was persistent. Asked me to teach her what I'd taught Clara. Asked me to share the stories. Asked me to help her start something new. The old man looked around the room as if seeing beyond its walls. So I did. We bought land here in Missouri, 20 acres, built cabins, started taking in women who needed safety, women running from violence, women who'd lost hope. We called it Winter's Haven. Pride filled his voice. Been running for 2 years now. Emma helps when she can send women our way. Ruth manages the day-to-day. I just tell stories and whittle and make sure everyone knows they're safe. We've helped 43 women so far, 43 second chances, 43 promises kept. Samuel looked at David. And that brings us to tonight, to you, to why I'm finally telling you this story. The old man set the bluebird on the table between them. Tomorrow morning a young woman is coming here. Her name is Anne. She's 19, running from her husband, pregnant, terrified. Ruth found her in town, brought her here, and I'm too old now to do what needs doing. My hands shake, my eyes are failing, my time is about up. His voice steadied. So I'm asking you, David, will you help her? Will you keep the promise going? The boy stared at his grandfather, understanding washing over him like cold water. Me. But I don't know anything about medicine or healing or any of it. Samuel smiled. Neither did I when I found Clara. Neither did Clara when she found Emma. You learn by doing. You teach by example. And you keep the promise because it's the right thing to do. He picked up the bluebird, held it out. This bird has been held by 6 people now. Margaret in spirit, me, Clara, Emma, Ruth, me again. Each of us passed it forward when the time was right. Now it's your turn. David reached out slowly, took the carved bird in his hands. It was lighter than he expected, smoother, worn by decades of touch and love and desperate hope. What if I fail? The boy whispered. Samuel's voice was firm. You will fail. Everyone does. I failed Margaret. I almost failed Clara a dozen times. But failing isn't the end. Trying again is what matters. Standing back up is what matters. Keeping the promise even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, that's what matters. The old man leaned forward. Listen to me, David. I'm 82 years old. I've lived through a war, through loss, through more pain than any man should bear. And I'm telling you, the only thing that made it worth it was keeping that promise. The only thing that gave my life meaning was helping Clara, and her helping Emma, and Emma helping others. That's what legacy is. That's what matters. He pointed at the bluebird. That's not just wood. It's every person who held it and was healed. It's every promise kept and passed on. It's proof that one act of kindness can ripple forward through generations. Samuel sat back. Tomorrow morning, Anne will knock on that door, and you'll answer it. You'll tell her she's safe. You'll give her food and shelter and time to heal. You'll teach her what you can, and when she's ready, she'll go help someone else. And the circle continues. The fire crackled. The snow kept falling, and David held the bluebird like it was made of spun glass. I'll try, he whispered. I'll try to do it right. Samuel smiled, and it was the warmest thing in the room. That's all any of us can do, try, and trust that trying matters. The old man stood slowly, every year showing in the movement. Come on, let me show you something. They walked to the front door. Samuel opened it, letting the cold December air rush in. Outside, through the falling snow, David could see 3 small cabins arranged around a central courtyard. Smoke rose from their chimneys, lights glowed in the windows, and on the porch of the nearest cabin a woman sat in a rocking chair knitting. That's Ruth, Samuel said. Emma's with her. They're preparing for Anne's arrival, making sure everything's ready, making sure she'll feel safe. He pointed to the other cabins. Those 2 are occupied. Mary in the left cabin, she came to us 6 months ago. Her husband broke her arm in 3 places. She's healing, learning to trust again. Sarah in the right cabin, she's been here a year. Ready to leave soon, strong enough now. Both of them will help with Anne. Both of them understand. David stared at the scene, understanding blooming in his chest like warmth after cold. "This is what the promise became," Samuel said quietly. "Not just one person helping one other, but a community, a system, a legacy that will outlive all of us." He put his hand on David's shoulder. "Your turn now, boy. Your turn to be part of it." They stood there together, grandfather and grandson, looking out at the snow-covered sanctuary Samuel Winters had built from a promise made in a dying woman's last moments 42 years earlier. Then, from down the road, they heard it. The sound of a wagon, the jingle of harness, someone arriving through the storm. Samuel squeezed David's shoulder. "That's her. That's Anne. You ready?" David looked at the bluebird in his hands, looked at his grandfather, looked at the warm lights of the cabins and the women who'd found safety there, and he understood finally what his grandfather had been trying to teach him all along. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about knowing everything. It wasn't even about succeeding every time. It was about showing up, about trying, about keeping promises even when they were hard, especially when they were hard. "Yes," David said, "I'm ready." The wagon pulled up to the main house. A young woman climbed down, moving slowly, one hand on her swollen belly. She was thin, pale, scared. Her dress was torn. Her face was bruised. She looked up at the house with desperate hope. David stepped out onto the porch. The bluebird felt warm in his hands despite the cold. He walked down the steps, his grandfather watching from the doorway. The young woman saw him coming, tensed, ready to run if she needed to. David stopped a few feet away, gave her space. "You're safe here," he said, and the words came easier than he expected. "My name is David. This is Winter's Haven. You're safe." Anne's face crumpled. She started to fall. David caught her, held her steady. "I've got you," he said. "We've got you. You're safe now." Ruth and Emma came running from the cabin, helped him support Anne, guided her inside toward warmth and safety and healing. Samuel stood in the doorway watching. Behind him on the mantel, the photograph of Margaret smiled at the scene. Somewhere in the mountains of Virginia, in a cabin-turned-clinic, Clara's spirit lived on in the lives she'd changed. Somewhere in the long chain of women helped and healed, the promise multiplied and spread like light in darkness. The old man turned back to the fire, settled into his chair, felt the weight of 82 years, and knew it had been enough. The promise would continue. David would keep it. And someday David would pass it to someone else, and the circle would go on. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, Anne was being settled in Ruth's cabin, given soup and blankets and time. David sat with her, not saying much, just being present, just showing her through his steadiness that this place was different, that these people were different, that she mattered. Later that night, when Anne was sleeping and the cabins were quiet, David came back to the main house. He found his grandfather still by the fire, the photograph of Margaret in his hands. "She would have been proud," Samuel said without looking up. "Margaret. She would have been so proud of what her promise became." David sat down across from him. "Will you tell me more about Clara? About Emma? About all of it?" Samuel smiled. "I will. We have time. Not a lot, maybe, but enough. I'll tell you everything I know, everything I learned, everything that matters." He set down Margaret's photograph with careful reverence. "And you'll carry it forward. You'll keep the promise alive, not because you have to, because you choose to, because you understand now that this is what gives life meaning. Connection, service, love passed forward through generations." The old man picked up the Bible from the table, opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. He read aloud, voice steady despite his years. "A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another, as I have loved you, that ye also love one another." Samuel closed the book. "That's the whole of it, David. That's what Margaret taught me, what I taught Clara, what Clara taught Emma, what we're all teaching each other. Love isn't just a feeling, it's action. It's choice. It's promises kept even when keeping them costs everything." He looked at his grandson. "You saved Anne tonight, just by showing up. just by saying she was safe and meaning it. That's how it starts. Always. One person, one moment, one choice to help instead of walk away. David nodded, understanding settling deep in his bones. What happens next? After Anne heals? Samuel smiled. She learns, she grows, she becomes strong, and someday when she is ready, she'll help someone else. Maybe she'll be a nurse like Emma. Maybe she'll open her own sanctuary like Ruth. Maybe she'll just be kind to someone who needs it. Doesn't matter. The promise spreads however it needs to. The old man yawned, exhaustion finally showing through. I'm tired, boy. Think I'll sleep now. You should too. Tomorrow's a big day. Anne will need help settling in. Ruth will want to teach you the routines. Emma will have questions. Life goes on. He stood slowly, every joint protesting. But before I go to bed, I want you to know something. Tonight, watching you help Anne, watching you step up without being asked, I saw what I needed to see. The promise is safe. It'll continue. That's all an old man can ask for. David stood too, went to his grandfather, hugged him tight. Thank you, he whispered, for telling me, for trusting me, for everything. Samuel held his grandson, this boy who was becoming a man, this next link in a chain forged by love and loss and promises kept. You're welcome, son. Now get some rest. Tomorrow the real work begins. They parted. Samuel climbed the stairs to his room, each step slower than the last. David stayed by the fire, the carved bluebird in his hands, thinking about everything he'd heard. Outside the snow had stopped. The sky was clearing. Stars emerged, countless points of light in the darkness. Promises from God that morning always comes no matter how dark the night. In Ruth's cabin, Anne slept deeply for the first time in months, safe and warm and protected. In her dreams, she wasn't running anymore. She was standing still. She was strong. She was free. And somewhere in the mountains of Virginia, in a cemetery beside a cabin turned clinic, 3 graves stood side by side. Margaret Winters, Thomas Winters, Samuel Winters, their bodies at rest. Their legacy alive and growing with each life, saved each promise, kept each act of love passed forward into darkness that became light. The bluebird carved by a dead man who learned to live again had flown further than anyone could have imagined. From Margaret's hope to Samuel's hands, to Clara's healing, to Emma's teaching, to Ruth's sanctuary, to David's choice, to Anne's future, and beyond, always beyond the promise, multiplying like stars in an infinite sky. Samuel Winters lay down in his bed that night, closed his eyes and smiled. He'd done what Margaret asked. He'd kept his word. He'd saved Clara and been saved in return. And now the promise would outlive them all, carried forward by people who understood that legacy wasn't about monuments or wealth or fame. It was about this: one scared girl given safety, one promise kept, one life changed, one choice to help instead of harm, one act of love in a world that needed more love than it knew. That was enough. That was everything. And as Samuel drifted into sleep, he heard Margaret's voice, soft as wind through pines, warm as summer sun on mountain stone. Well done, my love. Well done. The fire burned low, the stars wheeled overhead, the world turned toward morning, and in a farmhouse in Missouri, a carved bluebird sat on a table waiting for the next person who would need it, the next chapter in a story that had no ending, only continuations. Because some promises, once started, never stop. They just change hands. And that was exactly as it should be. The circle was complete. The circle was just beginning. And Samuel Winters, keeper of promises and guardian of second chances, had done his part. The rest was up to David, to Anne, to all the people who would come after, all the lives that would be touched, all the promises that would be kept. One person at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time, until the whole world knew what it meant to keep a promise. Until the whole world understood what Margaret and Samuel and Clara and Emma and Ruth and David had learned, that we save each other, always, forever, without end.